I hope you found the first session as interesting as I did. I've also had some fantastic feedback back from the breakout room. I think what is really emerging from the discussions in the breakout rooms is one common point that COVID does offer an opportunity to reassess and reevaluate policies, but there is no one solution for all. And so it's going to be really important to localize response policies, really working to build more resilient communities. But there'll be plenty more recommendations for the rest of the day that we will then put together and share after the conference. But now it is my absolute pleasure to move to the next session and hand over to ODI trustee and Professor Georgetown University Shanta Devarajan, who is, his reputation precedes him on these issues after many years of working on this at the World Bank. Shanta will be moderating the next session on redistribution and introduce the panelists. Shanta, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And it's my pleasure to moderate this session on what role for redistribution in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, it's no secret that inequality had been rising before the pandemic hit in many countries in the world, notably China and India, about half the countries in Africa, and several other around the globe. Now, the COVID pandemic has certainly made this much more serious a problem, not only because it disproportionately affects the poor, both in terms of the health effects as well as the economic effects of the response to the pandemic, but also that fiscal policy in almost every country is greatly stressed as a result of the global recession. And so the question in front of us today is, how do we, in this setting, try to adapt fiscal policy, both on the expenditure side in terms of social protection and other measures, but also on the revenue side with taxation, in order to avoid the increase in inequality that's almost inevitable in the pandemic, absent any intervention, but also to be able to put the world on a path to greater equity in the post-COVID-19 era. And to discuss these issues, I can't think of a better panel than the one we have today. Let me briefly introduce them, and then I'll turn to each of them for some questions. First, we have Pascal Saint-Amand, who's the Director for Tax Policy and Administration at the OECD. Next, we have Shara Razavi, who's the Director for Social Protection at the ILO, the International Labor Organization Office. Third, we'll have Marcelo Medeiros, who's a visiting professor in the Latin American Studies department at Princeton University, which also happens to be my alma mater. And finally, we have Chene Mukumba, who's joining us from Zambia. She's the Policy Research and Advocacy Manager at the Tax Justice Network, Africa. So let me first turn to Pascal. Since you are the Director for Tax Policy and Administration at the OECD, what can we do in terms of tax revenues? Because the needs have grown so much as a result of the pandemic. And also, we need to be able to use tax policy in order to achieve greater redistribution. What can be done, particularly in terms of some of the areas we've had some difficulty in the past, such as tax avoidance, tax evasion, and perhaps even wealth taxation?
Thank you, Shanta. Good afternoon to everybody, and thanks for the invitation for this extremely interesting session. Listen, very quickly, I would say that the pandemic is not bringing something fundamentally new there in terms of the need for developing countries to mobilize domestic resources. This appeared with the Sustainable Development Goals by the UN. It's been around for a number of years, in particular in Addis Ababa in 2015. Domestic resource mobilization is absolutely key. Developing countries need to grow their tax ratio, tax on GDP ratio, to be able to fund their development. And of course, the pandemic adds to that, but I would say paradoxically, we need to be careful not to bind the message, oh, there's the pandemic, the debt increase, you need to increase taxes, because if we increase taxes too quickly in response to the pandemic, we may face the same mistakes as the world made back in 2010 and 11 to do fiscal consolidation too early. So let's try not to link pandemic, fiscal consolidation, but rather there is, as you've said in your introduction, a need to reduce inequalities, a need for developing to grow, and this need should be reflected in strengthening domestic resource mobilization. So that's the first message. In Africa, the average is at 17% of tax on GDP. The OECD average is at 25%. We don't know what the exact rate is, but definitely below 20%, you struggle to fund your development. Second, once you've said that, it means that you'll have to increase some taxes. And to increase the taxes, you first need to make sure that the ones which exist are properly collected. And that's the work we've tried to do at the OECD. And the OECD now is 137 members as regards taxation. So it's really inclusive and broad. And that's the work we've done to fight what we call base erosion and profit shifting, to fight tax havens and put an end to bank secrecy. To fight bank secrecy, we have 161 countries on an equal footing at the Global Forum on Transparency. And this is about tax cooperation to make sure that we increase compliance and that we improve tax policies so that companies pay the fair amount of tax where they do their business, and that we don't have evasion from individuals or avoidance from companies. What is at stake here is big. If we take base erosion and profit shifting, the avoidance of corporate income tax is probably around 250 billion a year, and it's probably much more than that, hitting developing countries in priority because they more heavily rely on corporate income tax. Finally, to be very short, if we look forward and use the Build Back Better image, I think we need to do a few things. One, fighting climate change is key. Carbon pricing will have to happen because you need to price the negative externalities, and you have a lot of resource there. The political economy of this reform is extremely complex, in particular for emerging and developing countries, because they need to emit carbon because they need to grow. But there is also a need for the pricing, and the developed world, the European Union, the US will probably put in place border carbon adjustment to protect themselves against carbon leakage. So there is something to do there. We also need to improve the taxation of capital. Part of the globalization without tax regulation, which we've seen for 30 years, has translated into a shift of the tax burden from almost everybody to the people who cannot move, meaning the individuals, the men and the women in the streets, because of the increase of VAT and of personal income tax and social security contributions. We need to put more taxes or better taxes on capital income. And the exchange of information, the end of bank secrecy, should allow us to do that. And finally, as I said, and that's the work we're doing at the OECD currently, we need to make sure that we have an international tax system which fits for purpose, which allows to tax the digital companies and the digitalization of the economy, and which puts a safety net in terms of minimum tax at corporate income tax. So to summarize, and I don't talk about the expenses because the next speaker will do so, but to increase social protection, to increase the proper environment for business to thrive, but also for people to grow, we need to reduce inequalities, and this will be done through the tax tool.
Well, thank you very much, Pascal, for those that rich set of points, as well as keeping to time. So let me turn to Shara. Shara, as Director for Social Protection at the ILO, you're dealing with all the social protection programs, hundreds and almost thousands of programs that have emerged as out of the COVID pandemic. How can we use these programs to actually prevent an increase in inequality, in fact, improve equity, both in the short run as we're dealing with the emergency, but as Pascal was suggesting, in the longer run in the post-COVID era?
Thank you, Shanta, for that question, and thanks to ODI for the invitation. I think Pascal has made my job much easier because I agree with everything he said, actually, and I think that really was a great introduction to this topic that we're tackling today. Let me just add a few words by way of putting the sort of some of the inequalities between developing and the high-income countries into context before dealing with the question of what we need in terms of the social protection side of investments. And really, I do want to emphasize that these are investments that we make rather than just, expenditures. So first, I think it's really important to make the point that in this crisis, unlike previous crises, the high-income countries have actually done pretty well in terms of the fiscal response. But we know that nearly 9/10 of the global fiscal response to the COVID-19 crisis has taken place in high-income countries, averaging about 5% of their GDP. But shockingly, less than 3% of the total global stimulus, and probably by now even less than 3%, has occurred in the lower middle income countries. This is what the ILO has been referring to as the stimulus gap. So developed countries are spending, but developing countries are not able to do so. Secondly, I really do think it's important to say that even though developing countries don't have the luxury of being able to mount the kind of deficit spending on the scale that the high-income countries have been doing, it is disheartening that even those developing countries that don't have balance of payments constraints or high debt issues, they're not spending what they should be doing in order to address the crisis, because many of them fear the pressure of credit rating agencies and the financial markets. So in other words, what I'm saying is that, for both ideological as well as structural reasons to do with the mobility of capital and with the fear of capital flight, many developing countries are not doing what it takes to really counter this vicious spiral of economic contraction that has been unleashed by the crisis. Even when the IMF is saying that you should be spending as much as you can to get yourselves out of the current situation. But thirdly, and I think this is really the point that Pascal made beautifully, I think I couldn't agree more that there is a real need for developing countries to be increasing the amount of taxes that they do, that they are mobilizing, the resources that they're mobilizing through taxation, and increase their tax to GDP ratios, and that much more effort can be put into that. This is, as he said very rightly, a long-standing agenda item, which the Addis Ababa Action Agenda has highlighted, and we've been talking about it for a long time, and that we need to increase those taxes, in a progressive and equitable way. For example, by including wealth and inheritance taxes, which are going to be very effective, not only in mobilizing resources for investments in social protection, but also to address this rising tide of inequality, which has continued, by the way, throughout this crisis. When people have lost livelihoods, we heard from Bloomberg the stunning rise in the wealth of billionaires at the same time. And I would say that there's a real dire need for greater international cooperation on tax matters, not only with respect to tax havens, but also when it comes to taxing multinational corporations by having, for example, unitary taxation system whereby each country taxes their global profits based on the employment and share of sales. And then let me just say on the domestic resource mobilization, while this must be the cornerstone of national social protection systems, this has to be the main foundation. For developing countries, international coordination is absolutely going to be critical, particularly in the context of the crisis when they've lost all the revenues from dwindling remittances, from export revenues that have been disrupted, from falling commodity prices that has hit them very badly. And here, I think the issue of countries that are saddled with huge external debts is absolutely critical to find a workable solution for internationally agreed debt restructuring so that they're not forced to service their debts when they should be investing the limited resources that they have in public health and social protection systems. And now, with respect to social protection systems, we know that those with secure employment and adequate health coverage and social protection coverage, they've been able to weather the storm relatively well. And then we have 61% of the global workforce. That's 2 billion workers who have been affected by this crisis, informal workers who have been affected, and they are in the hardest hit sectors and remain uncovered by social protection systems. And this really is making them vulnerable to poverty. Invariably, They have not been able to count on contributory social insurance systems, but also they're not kind of poor enough, if you like, to qualify for these very narrowly targeted cash transfers that have been in vogue. So COVID-19, I think, has shown once again the limitations of a very narrowly targeted approach to social protection, which only targets the poorest of the poor and only responds when people fall into abject poverty, rather than preventing poverty in the first place, which means that we need to expand the scope of social protection and really make it universal, and to be able to prevent people from falling into poverty and not only responding when they're in extreme poverty. And during this pandemic, it's not just those who were in extreme poverty who've been badly affected, but also those who seem to be getting by relatively well, but who were hovering around the poverty line, and a little shock, and in this case, a big shock, has put them in dire straits. So extension of social protection to workers in the informal economy is absolutely key and critical. And this is what many countries have been doing during the crisis, but on a temporary basis. And this needs to become much more institutionalized. And this means covering workers who are, in the old informal economy, if you like, people in agriculture, smallholder farmers, but also the many people who are working in non-standard informal jobs on digital platforms and so forth. This is absolutely key. And I think we need to get away from this idea that is very narrowly targeted cash transfers or narrowly targeted safety nets are the way to go. And I hope that this crisis has hopefully created some consensus on the need to extend social protection to the billions of workers who are in the informal economy, including, as I said, both the old informal economy as well as emerging forms of informal, non-standard work.
Thank you, Shara. That's quite a wide-ranging treatise and extremely valuable. Okay, so now let me turn to Marcelo. Now you've heard basically Pascal focusing on the tax side, Shara talking about taxes, but also on the expenditure side. I was wondering whether you could put those two together in the context of Latin America and say, how can we use fiscal policy, both tax and expenditure policy, to both protect the most unequal region in the world from becoming more unequal, which is Latin America, but also how to put it back on a path of increasing redistribution. You're on mute, I think.
Well, thank you. What I have to say, I think, applies to most developing countries, but I think it also applies to other countries, developed countries as well. My argument is that developing countries, or maybe all countries, specifically Latin American countries, they should create sovereign social funds, sovereign funds that could be applied to fund social policies, and because those funds are convenient to finance counter-cyclical large-scale policies. They already exist. We use them to, for instance, to protect the financial system. Some states in the United States use them as the so-called rainy day funds for emergencies. But I think we should start thinking seriously about creating them in developing countries. And the reasons for this are, first, there will be new large-scale epidemics. And if not epidemics, there will be large-scale environmental crises affecting entire cities or entire regions of countries. And we should be preparing in advance to those crises. The existing protection systems, they have difficulties to respond to that, and essentially because they're cyclical. They depend on the yearly budgets, which in turn depend on the projected economic performance, and therefore they don't anticipate the shocks very well. And those crises, of course, are shocks. They cannot be anticipated. And also because the cyclical protection is either targeted at formal employment. It's a formal employment based. It's based essentially in the protection of formal employees. and through via Social Security, via unemployment insurance and other mechanisms, or it is chronic poverty based, which is the case of targeted policies and targeted assistance in general. So my argument here is that we should create sovereignty funds for protection as a way to fund large scale protection without dramatic macroeconomic impacts, without depending on fast increases in debt, and then the need to repay this somehow, and especially without the need of large scale political mobilization, which is necessary to create or to release emergency funds if crises are not countrywide, they're of a smaller scale, like affecting an entire city or entire region of the country. Would be very hard to mobilize the political capital necessary to release emergency funds to protect those people. So I think we should invest essentially in the creation of those funds. They would be much more a way of stabilizing the need of having extra funds to face emergencies. We have no microphone.
Sorry, we have a minute left, so I just want to ask one question that came to my mind when you were speaking, though. Could you say a little bit about how you're going to finance the fund? Where's the money going to come from? Is that taxation?
Of course, it has to come from taxation in advance. But the thing is that you don't have to finance in the same fiscal year. You should be like building the fund and feeding it over years.
I see. Okay, thanks very much. That's a provocative and interesting idea, and certainly one that's worked in other contexts, as you said. So it's worth exploring it. Let me finally turn to Chennai Mukumba, who's on the phone. I think we can't see her actually. And let me ask you. You've heard various proposals about increasing sources of revenue and taxation and use of taxation. What do you think are the prospects, particularly in Africa, for increasing tax revenues? And in particular, how do you weather the political resistance to these kinds of measures?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, and apologies that you can't see me. I think, when we're taking a look at taxation in Africa, as an institution, as Tax Justice Network Africa, I think one of the things that we have identified to be very key in not being able to enhance domestic resource mobilization to the extent that we want is political will. Often you tend to find that there are certain countries that do have the technical capacity, notwithstanding that, of course, technical capacity still remains an issue. But what we tend to find is that there are a number of actors within the ecosystem who are currently benefiting from the tax regime as it is. And often these actors are the very ones, who would require to change the system, right, in order to make it much more equitable. And so for us, one of the main impediments that we find to limiting domestic resource mobilization in many African countries is political will. But like I said, of course, technical capacity remains a huge, huge issue, of course, and that's why we have institutions such as ATAC that we work very closely with. Another issue that, of course, that we do a lot of work around is also the international financial architecture. I think on our part, when you take a look at the numbers, many African countries are losing resources through illicit financial flows. And in fact, in many African countries, the amount of money that they're losing is more than the overseas development assistance that they're getting. And this is particularly predominant in resource-rich countries, right? Often because of issues related to the resource curse. And so we do a lot of work around trying to democratize the international financial architecture so that we can put in place systems that are able to benefit many of these African countries. I think what we've seen due to COVID really is not necessarily a creation of problems, but an exacerbation of already existing issues that we have been facing, across the continent. But I think in response to your question, I would say that number one, working on political will, which is what we do. So trying to inform the citizenry about their rights. And I think, which is why this topic is really important, the social contract. I think that's really important, but also reform to the international financial architecture.
Thank you very much. Let me ask one quick follow-up question to your point about political will, which is encompasses a variety of things. But I think one particular point that I've certainly observed in Africa, in many African countries, is the fact that because governments have been quite ineffective in public spending, that much of the public spending doesn't go to the poor or even the middle class. That's where people are resistant to pay taxes. They don't want to pay more taxes if they're not going to get any benefit from it. So it seems to me that while working on the tax side, we may need to be working, or this is a question to you, I mean, do you think we can do better on the expenditure side in order to elicit a greater will for taxation?
Oh, absolutely. We definitely need to do much more on the expenditure side. I mean, in the first session, there were discussions about, the health sector, the education sector, all of those. I think those are very key sectors that need to be invested in, which we are not seeing sufficient spending going towards. And so absolutely right. I think political will to have our politicians and our policymakers directing resources towards those sectors is very key. And up until citizens are able to see the value of the taxes in two very tangible ways, such as education and health, it's very unlikely that you would have a citizen want to pay tax due to reasons such as that.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Okay.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Go ahead, Pascal.
I'm very unpolite, but I just wanted to react to what has just been said. I fully agree, and wanted to flag that. I mean, compliance with tax is linked to the quality of the service you receive, obviously, and that was your point, Chair. And you're absolutely right. I just wanted to mention that. We are working within the inclusive framework for the BEPS implementation on a detailed report on what we call tax morale, in particular in developing countries, precisely to identify what are the conditions to start a virtuous circle where you increase tax and you have satisfaction in return. And we try to do some report making the link between the quality of the health services and the level of tax. So that's a lot of work to do. So I just wanted to echo what was just said, which was so relevant.
And I think there's also some movement, these things called service delivery contracts, where people will pay higher prices for electricity or water, provided that they actually receive more electricity and more water. And if they don't, the government returns the money. And that actually helps to reduce the resistance to eliminating energy subsidies or water subsidies. Good. Okay. Well, thanks very much. That's very rich. Okay, let's go. Go ahead, Shara.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, that is exactly the argument and the reason behind the advocacy for universal social protection rather than very narrowly targeted protection that only reaches the very poor. Because if you want to have a social contract whereby the middle classes also pay their taxes, they have to see some benefit from those systems. And so this is why that famous statement by Amartya Sen and others have said, services for the poor become poor services. That is exactly the political economy argument behind universal social protection, and why we say targeting and narrow targeting of safety nets is not the way to go. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Actually, there's a question from the panel, from the audience. Which is along these lines. But it was for Pascal, so I'll start with Pascal. And the question is, what about reducing ineffective and inequitable tax expenditures as an avenue to increase government revenues to fund post-COVID recovery and sustainable financing for social protection?
Answer is yes, of course. That's how we need to start. And you know what? My next meeting in 10 minutes is with Colombia, which has put in place a commission I belong to precisely put an end to the wasteful tax incentives. African countries lose several points of GDP through wasteful tax incentives. And in the work I referred to on trying to improve the international tax system, we have two pillars, one on digital, but one in putting in place a global minimum tax, which could be a way to protect developing countries in particular, but not only, from wasteful tax incentives. So absolutely, that's how we need to start. It's not the end of the way, but that's how we need to start, both on VAT and on corporate income tax, personal income tax. Yes, fully agree.
Great.
Could I add something to that as well?
Yes, please. Shall I?
Sorry about that. I know you can't see me. I think absolutely. There's actually absolutely no research to make the case for tax incentives being one of the primary reasons many multinational companies are going into different countries. And so we're doing currently a lot of work to reduce what obviously then becomes the race to the bottom, right? Particularly if African countries are of the view that, the lower the taxes, the more private investment I can attract. So absolutely, I think I just want to agree with that. But I think also in response to that question, most absolutely, I think those who earn the most should pay the most. I think that's a mantra that we often say. And so particularly, I think one of the things we don't see within the African context is wealth taxes, for example, right? In many countries, there's no inheritance tax, property tax, etc. So we're seeing a lot of really wealthy people not contributing to the tax system, whereas they're the ones who actually have what one would say the space to do so, which is what we need to be seeing in our tax system.
Okay. Now there's a somewhat of a provocative question from the audience. It says, I hear quite a long list of demands, the cost of which sounds as though it greatly exceeds the tax raising options. Is this true? And if so, is there a risk of raising unrealistic expectations? Pascal, why don't we start with you?
Okay, I didn't want to jump in first necessarily, but happy to give a try. Yes and no. That's a fair question. It's true that we can do a wish list and try to do a Christmas tree. That's no longer the season, by the way. And create expectations which couldn't be met. So we need to be careful about that. But frankly speaking, today we're in a situation where the level of taxes is so low that in many countries you cannot do the basic. I would just like to share with you an experience I had a few years ago in Guatemala. I went there because they had bank secrecy, and I went there to be a bit tough and say you need to put an end to that. And just before the conference, I was dragged in a room aside by big bodyguards, and I met the vice president of the country, who told me, you know what? You need to tell these people, which was the parliament and the government, that you're going to blacklist us badly if we don't move away from bank secrecy, because we're not collecting taxes in these countries. And you have 140 murders a week which are not elucidated because we don't have a proper police. So please make sure that we can raise the taxes. That's the situation in so many countries where the levels are so low. So yes, there is still a lot of potential. Will these countries move to a Swedish model overnight? Of course not, and that would be unrealistic. But for the time being, the margins of maneuver are there, definitely.
Shara, do you have any thoughts on that? Because you had quite a long list of ambitions.
Yeah, we have. No, the truth is, on for example, meeting the basics of a social protection floor. This is what governments have already kind of endorsed. This was something that was unanimously adopted in the context of the ILO, with all member states agreeing to having, at the very least, a minimum social protection floor. And so therefore, we're not asking for huge luxuries here. These are the basics that governments are committed to, their citizens are clamoring for. And in a way, yes, some of the means of raising some of these resources may go against the interest of the elites when we are talking about the importance of inheritance taxes and wealth taxes. But on the other hand, those elites are living in these countries where if you're not meeting some of these demands, you really are at the risk of tearing apart countries through all kinds of risks of violent conflict, of aggression, of extremism in politics. We've seen a lot of that recently. And I think meeting those basic minimums of a social protection floor is the requirement for having the social peace that we need in order to be able to emerge from this crisis and to be able to have the kind of societies that we can all live in without fear and without having to spend lots of money on law and order and police and conflict and military expenditures. So I think it makes economic sense as well.
Okay, but then now there's a related question, and maybe I'll start with Chiney to answer it. On the issue of political will, many of the policy options advocated by the speakers run against clear political economy problems. How can the politics, and especially the interests of the elites, how can the politics of crisis response be shifted towards the need for more progressive policies? Chiney, do you have any? You want to start with that?
Yeah, I can hear you. I hope I heard your question correct. I think I think I mentioned earlier is that one of the reasons we haven't seen the political will that is so necessary is because for many politicians, it's in their interest for things to remain, right? The current status quo, many of them are currently benefiting from. And so what we would need to do is create a system whereby we are empowering the citizen and in a sense almost putting their political careers on the line. You know, if they themselves don't, for example, put in self-progressive tax systems that are benefiting the citizenry. And so I think because we are seeing this divorce between what is of most interest to the politicians vis-a-vis what's of most interest to the average citizen, we're not seeing this political will. And a lot of this is going to come from, you know, education, informing the citizenry so that they're not feeling like, you know, if the government, for example, has created a road of the favor, right? Those were actually resources that you contributed to, and in a sense, they're doing what their primary function is to be, which is to provide public services. And so I think that's one of the key things we need to do in terms of political will, finding a way to associate, you know, sort of the political space to the actual provision of public services and the demand of the citizens.
Marcelo, I'd like you to address this question too, and in terms of your proposal about the sovereign fund, because we know that sovereign wealth funds have also not succeeded very much around the world, and usually have been captured by political elites.
Chance of capture, but the key issue is how to establish a governance system so these funds cannot simply be used by politicians. It must be, to some extent, sufficiently independent from the day-to-day political process, so they cannot like be used regularly for political reasons. They should be used for more, quote, technical or emergency reasons, something funded more on reasonable arguments than on you know, the intentions of politicians with respect to re-elections and other things. So I mean, it is very clear that we should emphasize that. How to do that specifically, of course, it takes much longer than the few minutes we could discuss here.
Okay, yeah, and well, and also, but I thought, I was wondering whether you would address the question: what incentive does a government have, a sitting government have, to create one of these sovereign funds, given that it's tying its hands? You're saying,
yeah, I know. It releases its responsibilities to control the budget, because you have a parallel budget, you have an extra budget. So in case of an emergency, a government feels pressured, but because it has to spend money to address that emergency. If you have a fund for that, then the pressure on the government is going to be lower.
Okay. Yeah, but on the other hand, governments like to spend money on their friends, and
absolutely, yeah.
Giving them less chance to do that. Yeah. Okay, very good. Let's. I think we're reaching the end, so let me turn to the panelists for a last 1 minute takeaway that you'd like to share with the audience, and maybe I'll start in reverse order and start with you, Chiney.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, one of the things COVID perhaps unintentionally has done is made governments start to look at alternative sources of revenue. And I know, for example, in South Africa, for the first time, they're discussing wealth taxes, right? And this is something that, as a civil society organization, we've really been advocating for. I think because the citizenry, particularly in Africa, is so acutely aware of the current situation and the lack of the government to provide many of these public services, I think there is room for getting public support for some of these. Like I said earlier, wealth taxes, but even, for example, a discussion about revision of tax incentives. And so I think for many African countries, African governments, we're trying to ask them to start thinking through some of those ways of increasing domestic resource mobilization, which they haven't really, I think, impressed as much political will before.
Great, thanks. Marcelo.
Well, I just want to emphasize that the institutions we have lots of difficulties to face large-scale protection. Our protection was designed to protect individuals, with life occurrences. Protection was not designed to protect large-scale events, and we really should think about this. Maybe via the funds, maybe via something else, but we should pay attention to the need of large-scale protection. That's one very important lesson that we can learn from COVID.
Shara?
Okay, so maybe I'll just say that, for a very long time, I think those who have been promoting labor market deregulation have kind of portrayed informality as something that is inevitable and we have to learn to live with, rather than really helping us transition people into a more formalized and decent work kind of context. And the corollary to that of a deregulated labor market has been this kind of unfounded ideological assault on the relevance and effectiveness of social protection systems and social insurance systems in particular, while kind of sanctioning and saying that all we need are these means-tested safety nets to catch everyone who cannot pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, even though research has been showing all along that these safety nets are riddled with large exclusion errors, they provide low benefits, and they're complex and opaque and cannot really function in the way that they should. So there is, again, as I said, there's a political economy logic behind the plea for universalism and social protection. Generating trust between citizens and the state should be a priority for any government that really wants to emerge from this crisis and build a kind of peaceful and prosperous society. And the best and fastest way of doing that, of rebuilding trust, is by establishing a universal life cycle social security system, just as today's high-income countries did when they were emerging from the devastation of the Second World War. And not only will such a system act in a counter-cyclical manner by putting resources in the hands of those who will spend it on much needed household needs, which will have multiplier effects. In addition, I think when everyone sees concrete benefits from a universal social security system, which really delivers, then they will also be much more willing to pay taxes and make contributions, and therefore create this virtuous circle that can generate fiscal resources that we all say is needed domestically in order to create social protection systems. Thank you.
Good, thanks. Pascal?
Listen, very quickly, as we're over time, we can increase the revenue and GDP ratio, in particular in developing countries or in developing countries, and we must do it. We must fight inequalities, and the tax system can help doing so everywhere, including in developing countries. And maybe the last word is about the challenges and the opportunities from the digitalization of the economy. Fighting informality may be facilitated by the fact that everybody now has a smartphone or a phone which is connected, and the connection may allow the tax administration to better know what's happening, to provide the right incentives, which are not the big tax incentives for large multinational companies, but get people slowly in the formal system together with that, because of the increased uncertainty which will come with the digital world, larger safety net, social security protection. I think that's the future, and probably a nice way to conclude our panel.
Exactly. Thanks very much. Those are very good words to conclude by. Before I close the session, though, I want to remind the audience that we now move to these breakout groups, and there'll be three: one on tax and redistribution, one on social protection, and one on the role of multilateral organizations. And you can access the links on the chat box. on the page. So let me close by thanking the panelists for a very rich and interesting discussion full of new ideas. I got a whole long list of things I want to think about. And I hope that, and I want to thank the audience for their questions, which actually provoked quite a good discussion, and wish you all the best as we go forward in this very, very important topic.